Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'm going to be sharing ghost stories from Utah. Let's get into it. Story 1. My mother divorced my father in 2000, and by 2001 we were living with her boyfriend and soon-to-be husband Eric. I was new to his home and city. I quickly made friends with a superstitious girl who was not afraid to try something at least once. We were both raised LDS Mormons, and we were both doubting our religion. In an attempt to answer many questions, she and I decided to use her sister's Ouija board. Some of our questions were answered, but many remained unanswered. Slightly disappointed, we went to her room to talk. That night, as we lay in her room, unable to sleep, we began to hear shuffling noises outside of her bedroom door. Afraid to open the door, we turned on the light and watched her door, praying that it would remain shut. Unfortunately, the door did not remain shut. I have heard many stories of doors creaking open on their own, and if the door opened, I just expected it to creep open. It did not. The door violently swung open, revealing the dark hallway. The light in her room did not just turn off, the bulb light burst out. We sat screaming in the darkness, hoping someone would hear us and come to our aid. Unfortunately, we were the only living souls at home that night. We ran from her room upstairs and out the front door. We went immediately to her longtime friend's house, where we stayed for the remainder of the night. The next morning, we cautiously entered her home to find her room totally trashed. All of her things were thrown around. The room and her mattress was laying next to her bed. When her parents came home, they called the police and reported it as an intruder. It baffled the police. They didn't know where the intruder entered from, what his motive was, how the light just burst and not a single fingerprint was found. We thought that we were through with whatever had entered the room that night, but we were wrong. Every night around 2:30 to 3:30 a.m. for the next month, I was tormented. I would hear my name in the darkness and was once even forced awake by bed shaking. My mother dismissed my stories as outrageous and as an attempt for attention. I refused to sleep in my room and was often found on the couch in our living room in the mornings. Then 1 month after the first attack, it just stopped. I began to think that maybe I was delusional and maybe suffering from a psychotic episode. I did my best to just forget, but couldn't. It was like having something lurking just in front of you in the darkness waiting. 2 years later, after putting with an immense amount of bullshit at my mother's home, I moved in with my father and his family. I felt safe at my dad's home and was able to live my life like none of it had ever happened. I was carefree and living on the edge. My dad gave me space, understanding, and time to heal. Once I settled down and finally was free of my burdens, it began again. This time, it was more subtle. I would dream about hate and unspeakable horrors. One of my worst dreams was of a young girl committing suicide after being violently molested by her best friend. I would wake up in a sweat, always at 5 in the morning. It still happens today. If I manage to get a dreamless night, I am awakened by the whispering of my name. Whatever it has not only attacked me, it has also attacked my friend, who has suffered more than me by far. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 2. I have lived, in my opinion, an unordinary life. If you have heard my previous story, you know that I have bounced from place to place. I can't stand the ordinary. After I moved in with my father at the age of 17, he and his family had just moved from a home in Tremonton, Utah, to my father's hometown of Camas, Utah. We moved into Afton Brimmel's house. This is the first time that I had lived in a home that had its own name. Afton Brimmel was a good friend of my father's and grandmother's. He and his wife passed on before I had met either of them. Afton and his wife both died within the home, which at the time did not bother me. Death by this time was something that I expected and was more comfortable with than some. When we walked in for the first time, my stepmom and best friend turned to my dad and told him that she couldn't live there. She said that she felt like she was unwanted in the house. I felt nothing. My stepmother could not sleep when my dad was away on business, and by this time I was beginning to feel unwanted as well. My stepmom and I decided to stick together and not let whatever was in our home bother us. About a month later, business started to slow down and my dad started to spend more and more time at home. As soon as he began spending more time at home, the feelings began to become actions against us. At this time, not only was I experiencing problems with the presence in our home, but I was also dealing with a can of worms that I had opened at my friend's home in South Jordan. The attacks in our home began with my stepmom and then extended to me. The most terrifying of all experiences was on my stepmom's birthday. We went to dinner at Trolley Square together as a family and to Temple Square to hear the choir sing. When we came home that night and separated to our rooms, I began to notice that the usual feeling of being watched in my room was gone. I didn't know if I should be relieved or concerned. Just then all the lights in the house flickered and went out. When they came back on, every electronic device in our home activated. At first we thought that maybe it was a power surge, but then it became evident that it was not. We turned off all of our electronic devices, at which point my little sisters were too scared to go to bed. My two sisters shared a room next to mine, so of course, being the wonderful sister that I am, I walked them back to bed. Once in my room, my stereo turned on and began to play one of my favorite songs at the time. Now, naturally, I would not be bothered except for the fact that the song, I believe, was a warning. The band that plays this song is CKY, and the song title is Escape from Hellview. This bothered me. Though I loved the song, the message was clear. I quickly turned off my stereo and stayed in my room, feeling if I left in a panic, it would scare my sisters. After a few minutes, the stereo downstairs began to play, volume up all the way, the song that I had just turned off. My sisters and I met at the stairs and looked down the banister at the living room where the stereo was. My dad burst out of his room furious. He began screaming Afton's name. This scared me. He began ranting about how Afton had destroyed a good night and upset his family. I've seen my dad upset and can tell you from experience, you don't want him mad at you. So naturally my sisters and I sat quietly listening to him rant, trying not to give away our position to my dad. Once he was done yelling, he went to bed. Now the thing that bothered me the most was the fact that it had never happened again while my dad was at home. I believe that Afton respected my dad enough to not attack us while he was home. 1 year later, my stepmom had had enough, so we moved again. I have never been back to that house and never wish to return. Story 3. In my life, I had many experiences that I cannot explain. I began to think that there was something wrong with me. I was hearing things and feeling things that scared me. I felt alone. I tried to tell my mom, but she kept telling me that I was just trying to get attention and was scaring my little sisters. When I moved in with my dad, I again began to have experiences that I could not explain, but this time I was not alone. My stepmom was experiencing the same things as I. I began to ask my family about any experiences that they had. I was shocked by all the experiences that my dad's side of the family has had, and more shocking, some of my mom's side of the family. These are just a few of the stories that I was able to collect. It leads me to believe that I am more prone to these experiences than others. Anyway, here are some of my favorite stories. My dad has only spoken of this story once. I think that it hurts too much to retell it. My dad as a teenager was wild. Some of his stories seem too outrageous to believe, but you know how stories can go. They get bigger and bigger over time. But no matter what the story, there is always his trusty sidekick. This sidekick was not only my dad's best friend, he was his cousin as well. I think it's better not to give my dad's best friends a name, don't you? Anyway, at the young age of 25, my dad's friend slash cousin died of cancer. His death was traumatic and, as I understand it, painful. About 5 years later, my mother was expecting her third child, but unfortunately she miscarried. My dad was away on business when it happened. When he came home, he shared a remarkable story with us. His cousin slash friend had visited him during his trip, and he wasn't alone. He was holding a young girl by the hand that my dad can only describe as looking incredibly similar to me. In fact, he admits at the time that he thought it was me. He said that his friend, told him that everything is okay. He told my dad that, and I quote, "I have her, she is safe with me." It was a great comfort to my dad when he needed it most. My mother refused to tell me anything that happened in her family, so I went to my grandpa. Grandpa had never lied to me and has always told me what my mother refused to. He said that one of the most incredible experiences that he had ever had was when he and my grandmother moved into their present home. My grandpa was having a hard time and was experiencing things that he could not explain. He said that all of his kids were afraid to go upstairs, so he decided to go upstairs to see what was wrong. As he walked up the stairs, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He could feel the presence of something lingering just behind him. He said that he took a deep breath and just kept walking up the stairs like nothing was wrong. He entered the first room at the top of the stairs. The feeling intensified, but he just kept pretending that everything was fine. When he finally got downstairs, he related the story to my grandma. He still to this day claims that if he had turned around, he knew he would have seen it. My stepdad's mother had quite a few interesting stories that, though they do not affect me, they are extremely creepy. My step-grandmom's mother moved her family into a larger home due to growth in their family. She remembers that there was always an empty place at their crowded table. I found this odd because her mother had 8 children and yet they always kept a place at their small table open. Why? Because if ever a plate was set in the particular place, it would crack. Whatever was in the home did not allow anyone to sit in that certain spot of the table. The same woman, in her younger years, lived in a small home just after marrying her husband. She was cleaning her home when she was suddenly attacked from behind. Someone or something was choking her to death. She was not a religious woman, but had once heard that if you invoke the name of Christ, nothing unearthly can harm you. So in an act of faith, she invoked the name of Christ. Just after she invoked his name, it stopped. She immediately got up and checked every room in the house. There was nothing. One of my favorite stories is of my uncle and his visitor in the night. He was asleep in his room when he heard a noise and looked at the foot of his bed. There, standing in authentic pioneer garb, was a young boy. He just stared back, and as is traditional in my dad's family, it doesn't matter if the world is coming to an end. You just go back to sleep and thinking about it in the morning. Unfortunately, I could never do that. Story 4. About 4 years ago when I was 8, I had an assignment in school to talk about scary things that have happened to us. Well, I had one I would never forget. I was getting into bed when I felt this strange chill. Even though it always happens to me, for some reason this one was different. I ignored it and I went to sleep. In my dream I saw this man telling me to wake up, but I really didn't have control over that. Then I woke up, nothing. I went to sleep and the same man was there and said, "Wake up." By now I was a little creeped out. I woke up again, but this time my little sister was right by me. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she saw a scary man in her dream, so I let her sleep in my room. When I went back to sleep, I saw the man again, and he said the same thing, but he added on to it. He said, "I won't leave until you get my message. Wake up." By now, I was flipping out, but when I got up the third time at that moment, I realized what he meant, or I thought I did. I need to wake up my sister and hold her hand while we sleep. So she got into bed with me and we held hands while we slept. But before that, she said she kept on seeing the man, but didn't after that. Was he a dead person who had a grudge against me and my sister and came to haunt our dreams? Who knows? Story 5. This happened to me 7 years ago, and to this day, I still can't sleep with my legs stretched out so that my feet are near the end of the bed. I went to bed that night just like I would any other night, nothing out of the ordinary, only I awoke at 3 a.m. to something grabbing and tugging at my left foot. When I opened my eyes and began to sit up, whatever it was let go. My first reaction was to start yelling at my little brothers for waking me up, but then I realized that my door was still closed, and if it had been one of them, I would have heard them running out, or they would be standing in there with me. I slept on a mattress on the floor. White trash, I know, so no one could have hidden under my bed. My closet didn't have a door and was so crammed full of stuff that no one could have hidden in it. Still thinking that it was somehow one of my siblings, I turned around to look at the clock. It was 3 a.m. This may or may not be important, but it is a little odd that ever since then, I wake up every night around 2:30 to 3 a.m. Since I was still half asleep and had ruled out anyone in my house as the culprit, I just went back to sleep, which is a little odd since the next morning upon waking up I remembered what happened and was very freaked out and still had no idea what could have grabbed my foot. There was firm pressure like a hand and the tugging was hard enough to wake me up, and it didn't let go until I actually started to sit up, so I really don't think this could have been a dream. Sleep paralysis is something I have experienced a number of times, and this was nothing like any of those. I would love to know what other people think this may have been. Story 6. I thought I would share some recent experiences that occurred when we moved from Utah to Boise, Idaho. I transferred to my company's Salt Lake City office in June 2007. We didn't know where we wanted to live yet, so we decided to temporarily rent a house located a couple of blocks away from my in-laws' place in Roy, Utah. The neighborhood was one in which my wife grew up, and she knew the homes and the people very well. The home that we rented was only about 4 or 5 years old, built at the end of a cul-de-sac near the main road through Roy, 1900 West. We were all excited to go back in Utah and weren't at all prepared for the events that would follow. That first night in the house, my wife and I were awakened by a sound of little feet bounding noisily down the hallway and then down the stairs to the basement. I looked at the clock and it wasn't even 5 a.m. yet. We have 3 young children, and I didn't put it past one of them to simply be excited to be in a new house and want to wake up early to watch morning cartoons in the basement. Groggy and annoyed, I made my way downstairs, fully expecting to see SpongeBob SquarePants or something like that blaring on the TV in the basement. As I reached the TV room in the basement, however, all was dark and quiet. I was pretty surprised and confused, and thought that maybe my kids saw me coming and sneaked back up to bed, afraid that they would get in trouble, though such sneaking was highly uncharacteristic of my kids. I went back upstairs to check on each one of the kids, and all 3 of them were sound asleep, and I mean sound asleep, snoring away. Okay, I thought, either my kids are really good actors or something really creepy just happened. My wife and I talked about it, and she got pretty freaked out because she heard the footsteps as clear as I did. I had decided to put it out of my mind. A few days later, I was awake pretty early, getting ready for work. I went into the bathroom with my clothes for the day to take a shower and get dressed. I hung my clothes next to my towel on the towel rack, and I draped my belt over the rack. After I finished my shower, I opened the shower curtain and reached for my towel. As I was reaching for it, the belt started swinging back and forth violently for about 15 seconds, and then it slowly stopped. I froze in shock. The belt was completely still. I reached for the towel, and then the belt just started swinging right in front of my eyes. I thought that I was losing my mind. I checked the heater vent to see if that could have been the cause, but it was clear on the other side of the bathroom. I thought that maybe I had bumped the towel and had caused the belt to swing, but to be honest with myself, I hadn't touched it. I was in the act of reaching for it. I thought that maybe pulling back the shower curtain created a draft that caused the belt to swing. I played with the curtain for a few minutes trying to get the belt to swing again, but it didn't even budge. At this point, I was pretty freaked out myself, and I decided not to tell my wife about the belt incident so as not to cause her more fear or panic. After these events, the house just had an unsettling feeling. I don't know if it was because I was just freaked out or if there really was something else in the house with us. Those feelings seemed especially intense early in the morning before the sun came up. I would feel the most fear and dread when I went downstairs during those hours. Even if the lights were on, I still feel a sense of unease that I never felt at any other time during the day or night. We only stayed in that house for 6 months before we moved to the Provo area so that I could finish my graduate degree at BYU while I continued working for my company. After those first few events, I never saw or heard anything unnecessarily strange again until a few nights before we moved. I was home alone with the children in the evening. My wife was gone to a church event, and I was getting dinner ready for the kids. Good old mac and cheese. I had a pot of water warming up on the stove with the lid on it, as my kids and I were still sitting around the kitchen counter, talking and laughing with one another. The lid on the pot of the water started rattling violently, enough that it really startled my 5-year-old daughter. I told her that it was nothing, that the water was simply boiling and the steam was making the lid rattle. I went over to the pot and lifted the lid. The water in the pot was perfectly calm and still heating up. "Was it the boiling water, Dad?" my daughter asked. "Yep, it was. See, I told you," I lied to her. I put the noodles into the cold water so that she would further believe me. Okay, I'm an intelligent, methodical, and well-educated guy who doesn't deny that this kind of stuff can happen to other people, but never thought that it could happen to me. Were these events real, or was the stress of moving my family and getting a new job just affecting my mind? If they were real, why didn't anything else happen for months following the first few events? I'd be curious to contact people that are renting the house now and find out if they've had any weird, unexplainable experiences. However, I don't want to get too involved with this and just leave it alone as one of those really strange things that you have in your life that you hope never happen again. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.